Donald Trump has signed a bill compelling the Justice Department to release files related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. This follows almost unanimous approval in Congress and growing pressure from his most ardent supporters. Trump made the announcement on Truth Social, saying Epstein, who was charged by his first administration in 2019, was a lifelong Democrat who donated thousands of dollars to Democrat politicians and was deeply associated with many well-known Democrat figures, such as Bill Clinton. He says the truth about the Democrats and their associations may soon be revealed because I have just signed the bill to release the Epstein files.
Welcome, guys. Adam is here. So this is happening right now. Trump signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act himself. Not under veto override, not under duress, his own pen, his own signature, mandating the DOJ release every unclassified Epstein document by a specific legal deadline. And then his own Justice Department simply didn't do it.
Earlier, U.S. Attorney General Pam Bondi said the Justice Department will release all files within 30 days and according to law.
We have released over 33,000 Epstein documents to the Hill, and we'll continue to follow the law and to have maximum transparency. Also, we will always encourage all victims to come forward.
Do you mean that you will provide all the files by 30 days?
We will follow the law. The law passed both chambers. We will continue to follow the law, again, while protecting victims, but also providing maximum transparency.
No exceptions written into the law, no discretionary wiggle room, just a president who signed a transparency mandate and then buried it. It's the most perfectly documented example of this administration saying one thing and doing the exact opposite. Let me take you inside the numbers because the numbers don't lie and they don't have a political affiliation. The Justice Department under Pam Bondi admitted there were roughly 6 million pages of responsive documents.
3 million pages, 2,000 videos, 180,000 images. The latest dump from the Epstein files after weeks of political pressure. There are extremely serious allegations in these files against some of the most powerful people in the world. Not all of the information in there will be verified or necessarily true, but there are allegations about President Trump that he's previously dismissed as nonsense. Also included video of Ghislaine Maxwell being interviewed, refuting she knew that girls giving massages to Epstein were under 18.
Because when I was there, when I was present, at the time that I was present, the people that gave Jeffrey, men and women who gave Jeffrey massages were adults.
6 million pages of names, flights, emails, black book entries, FBI interview summaries, tip line call logs, everything. By the time the first release window closed, approximately 3 to 3.5 million pages had been made public. Do the math with me. That leaves somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million pages still sitting inside the Justice Department, unreleased, unaccounted for, hidden from the American people, despite a law that said release them all.
The US Department of Justice says it's released another tranche of documents, 3 million pages worth, related to the late convicted sex offender Jeffrey Epstein. The US Deputy Attorney General, Todd Blanche, has been holding a news conference in the last hour and said 2,000 videos and 180,000 images have been released. A small portion of what's known as the Epstein Files was released by the DOJ back in December of last year, following a congressional bill signed into law to make the files public within 30 days. However, until now, fewer than 1% of the files on Jeffrey Epstein have been made public. Well, our teams are going through the latest batch that's been released by the Department of Justice, released in the last hour.
2.5 to 3 million pages of evidence that the law specifically required to be in your hands and mine that are instead gathering digital dust on some government server while the people who signed that law pretend everything is fine. The question you should be screaming right now is what exactly is in those missing pages? And the answer to that question is exactly what lawmakers from both parties and investigators from outlets like NPR, BBC, Al Jazeera, The Guardian, and NBC have been demanding to know for months. So let me give you the specific documented facts because this is not speculation. This is not conspiracy theory. This is reporting from credible organizations who have been covering this document release process in forensic detail. NPR and the BBC conducted independent investigations and found something devastating. Dozens of pages involving sexual abuse accusations connected directly to Donald Trump were missing from the public database, even though the government's own internal indices, their own document tracking systems, show those pages exist. Let me say that again because I need you to understand how damning this is. The Justice Department's own internal records confirm that specific documents containing allegations connected to Trump are in the system. And those specific documents are not in the public database that the Epstein Files Transparency Act required them to be released into. A top Democrat responded to that finding by saying the DOJ is withholding Trump-related abuse files from the American people. That is not a political attack ad. That is a documented finding based on the government's own paper trail. When the government's own indices show documents exist and those documents are not in the public release, there is exactly one explanation. Someone decided those specific documents should not see the light of day despite a federal law that said they had to. And the question of who made that decision and why is the entire story. Now, let me take you to the hearing room because this is where the cover-up accusations became official. In a bombshell House hearing, Democrats stood up and accused Bondi and the Trump DOJ of running a massive Epstein cover-up. They pointed to the millions of unreleased pages. They pointed to the heavy redactions that blanket the documents that were released, especially where those documents touch on politically exposed figures. This is not a press release. This is not a social media rant. This is sworn congressional testimony from lawmakers who have examined the specific documentary record of what was released and what was not. They made formal accusations of cover-up conduct in the most public and most official forum available. And then something happened that should make every single person watching this video sit up straight in their chair. The concerns went bipartisan: Thomas Massie, a Republican, and Ro Khanna, a Democrat. These two do not agree on much. They are from opposite parties. They represent different Americas. And both of them have warned that Pam Bondi could face obstruction of justice charges for redacting or withholding the names of government officials from the Epstein files. When a Republican like Thomas Massie is using obstruction of justice language about a Trump-appointed attorney general in connection with the Epstein document release, the bipartisan character of the concern is the specific signal that tells you this is not politics. This is people looking at the same documented record and reaching the same alarming conclusion. Are you kidding me? Bipartisan obstruction warnings about the sitting attorney general do not happen in the normal course of political disagreements. They happen when the documented evidence of specific conduct is serious enough that people who disagree about everything find themselves agreeing about the fundamental character of what they are seeing. Now let me tell you about what is actually in the files that did get released, because this is the context that makes the missing millions so terrifying. According to reporting from Al Jazeera and other outlets, the released files contain emails and communications in which Epstein and his associates discussed Trump. One message noted that Trump knew about the girls. Another witness claimed that everyone has known he has been doing this. And there is at least one specific woman who accused Trump of assault in the release materials. The DOJ characterizes these allegations as unverified and sensational. But here is the thing. If the released portion of the documents already contains this level of specific and damaging allegation against the President of the United States, what in God's name is in the portion that has not been released? The 2.5 to 3 million pages that the law said must be made public and that the government is still sitting on. That question is the core of the cover-up story, and it is a question that the documented gap between the internal indices showing the documents exist and the public database that does not contain them makes impossible to dismiss. Let me walk you through the legal framework because this is where the cover-up story becomes something that lawyers and judges and possibly juries are going to have to wrestle with. The Epstein Files Transparency Act did not ask for good faith efforts. It did not provide for administrative discretion about which documents to prioritize. It required full release of all unclassified responsive documents within a specific legal deadline. A Justice Department that has admitted to approximately 6 million responsive documents and released only half of them by the deadline is not in compliance with the law. Not arguably in compliance. not partially in compliance, subject to interpretation. Not in compliance. And a president who signed the law and whose Justice Department is not compliant with it is presiding over exactly the kind of deliberate non-compliance with a specific legal obligation that the cover-up framing most accurately captures. Come on, this is not complicated. The law said release all unclassified documents. The documents were not all released. The people responsible for not releasing them knew the law required release. The specific documents not released include documents that internal indices confirm exist, and that credible reporting identifies as specifically connected to Trump-related allegations. That is the documented factual foundation of the biggest cover-up framing. Now let me take you deeper into the suppression pattern because there are three specific dimensions here that compound each other in ways that make the cover-up characterization inescapable. The first dimension is the raw numbers gap. 6 million responsive documents admitted, 3 to 3.5 million released, 2.5 to 3 million missing. That is not a minor administrative shortfall. That is nearly half of the total responsive document universe, nearly half of a disclosure that the law specifically required to be complete. That is documented in the government's own admissions. The second dimension is the redaction pattern. When documents are released but the names of specific individuals connected to the most sensitive allegations are blacked out, the functional effect is the same as not releasing those portions of the documents at all. The specific information that would be most damaging, the names of powerful people connected to specific allegations, is withheld from public view through the redaction mechanism. Lawmakers have specifically pointed to this pattern of redactions being most concentrated in exactly the portions of documents that touch on politically exposed figures. If legitimate legal privilege were driving the redaction decisions, the pattern would correlate with legal privilege categories. But it correlates with political sensitivity instead. That correlation is the most damaging evidentiary signal about the character of the redaction decisions. And then there is the third dimension, the internal indices finding. This is the single most specific and most legally damaging piece of the entire suppression pattern because it removes the possibility of innocent administrative explanation. When the government's own internal document tracking systems confirm that specific documents exist, and those specific documents are not in the public release, the gap between the indices and the release is documented in the government's own records. You cannot claim the documents do not exist when your own indices show they do. You cannot claim they were inadvertently overlooked when they are specifically identified in the internal tracking systems. The only available explanation is a decision, a specific and deliberate decision to exclude those specific documents from the release that the law required. And when those specific documents are the ones that credible reporting identifies as connected to Trump-related allegations, the decision to exclude them from the legally mandated release is the most specific and most directly documented evidence of the cover-up. Are you kidding me? The government's own records are the evidence of the cover-up. That is not something you can spin away with a press conference or a social media post. Let me talk to you about the legal exposure because this is real. The obstruction of justice statute covers conduct that corruptly obstructs or impedes official proceedings. A Justice Department that is required by specific statute to release documents and that instead withholds them in ways that are specifically designed to prevent specific information from entering the public record is engaging in conduct that at minimum raises serious obstruction questions. The bipartisan warnings from Massey and Khanna about obstruction charges are not rhetorical excess. They are specific applications of the obstruction statute to the specific documented pattern of non-compliant document suppression, and legal scholars with no political interest in the outcome have independently said this raises genuine legal concerns. The obstruction analysis is not complicated. A law required document release. The documents were not released. The decision not to release them was deliberate. The documents contain information directly relevant to ongoing and potential official proceedings. Those four elements create the specific factual foundation for an obstruction analysis that the bipartisan congressional warnings are correctly identifying as the most serious legal consequence of the documented non-compliance. And then there is the perjury exposure. Bondi has testified under oath about the document release process. If she testified about the completeness of the release in ways that are inconsistent with the internal indices that confirm documents exist that were not released, that specific gap between sworn testimony and documented reality is the most precise and most legally actionable form of perjury exposure. The cover-up story and the Bondi accountability story are the same story approached from different directions. The cover-up story documents the conduct. The perjury story documents the sworn statements about the conduct, and the gap between the sworn statements and the documented conduct is the specific legal exposure that makes both stories so urgently relevant. Now let me take you to history, because the Watergate comparison is not hyperbole. It is the most instructive context for understanding what this story represents at the most fundamental constitutional level. Watergate was ultimately a story about a president using the power of his office to suppress information that would damage him personally and politically. The specific mechanisms through which that suppression was attempted, the obstruction of the investigation, the destruction of evidence, the misleading testimony to Congress, are the same categories of conduct that the Epstein document suppression story documents in the current context. The specific thing that made Watergate the defining political scandal of the modern era was not the break-in itself. It was the cover-up, the deliberate use of official power to prevent accountability for specific conduct. In the Epstein document suppression story, a president who signed a transparency law presiding over a Justice Department that is not complying with it in ways that specifically protect documents connected to his own alleged conduct is the most direct available parallel to exactly that Watergate dynamic. The biggest cover-up framing is not hyperbole. It is the specific historical and constitutional characterization that the documented conduct most directly corresponds to. The documented suppression pattern combining the raw numbers gap, the heavy redactions concentrated in politically sensitive portions, and the internal indices confirming documents exist that are not in the public release creates the most specific and most legally damaging evidence of deliberate non-compliance with the Epstein Files Transparency Act. The raw numbers gap is not an administrative shortfall. Nearly half the total responsive document universe unreleased by the legal deadline is deliberate suppression at scale. The redaction pattern correlating most strongly with political sensitivity rather than legal privilege categories is the specific evidence that the redaction decisions are politically rather than legally driven. And the internal indices finding is the single most damaging piece of evidence because it documents the gap between what the government's own systems confirm exists and what has been released in the government's own records rather than in outside reporting. The bipartisan obstruction of justice warnings from Thomas Massie and Ro Khanna are the most important and most specifically credible signal in the entire accountability story, because they represent members of Congress from opposite parties reaching the same alarming conclusion about the same documented record. Massie is a Republican, Khanna is a Democrat. They disagree about almost everything, and they are both warning about obstruction of justice charges for the same Attorney General based on the same documented pattern of non-compliant document suppression. That bipartisan convergence on the same legal characterization of the same documented conduct is the most powerful available signal that the obstruction analysis is grounded in specific applicable legal principles rather than in political opposition. When Republicans and Democrats are using the same obstruction of justice language about the same documented conduct, the concern is real and the legal analysis is specific. The president who signed the Epstein Files Transparency Act presiding over a Justice Department that is not complying with it in ways that specifically protect documents connected to his own alleged conduct is the most direct and most specifically documented example of the gap between public commitment and private reality. Trump signed the law. The law required full disclosure. The disclosure is not complete. The missing documents include documents that internal indices confirm exist and that credible reporting identifies as connected to Trump-related allegations. The gap between the public signature on a transparency law and the private suppression of exactly the documents most relevant to the person who signed it is the specific and most direct available evidence that the transparency commitment was not genuine. The signature is on the law. The documents are missing. The indices confirm they exist. The reporting identifies their relevance to Trump. The cover-up is documented in the government's own records. Here is exactly what we need to watch as this story continues to develop. Watch the congressional oversight proceedings and any formal contempt or obstruction referrals that flow from the documented non-compliance. Formal congressional action on the non-compliance is the most immediately consequential official response available. Watch any court proceedings related to media or advocacy organization requests for the release of the missing documents, because judicial intervention would represent the most powerful available check on executive branch non-compliance. Watch the specific documents that get released in any subsequent tranches for any indication that the political sensitivity filtering is continuing or being corrected under pressure. And watch the Bondi accountability proceedings for any specific testimony about the document release decisions that creates additional documented discrepancies between sworn statements and the underlying documentary record. So here is the absolute bottom line. Congress passed the Epstein Files Transparency Act. Trump signed it. The Justice Department admitted to roughly 6 million responsive documents and released only half. Investigative reporting found that documents involving Trump-related allegations confirmed by internal indices to exist are missing from the public database. House hearings produced formal accusations of a massive Epstein cover-up from lawmakers who examined the documentary record. Massey and Khanna issued bipartisan warnings about obstruction of justice charges for Bondi. And the emails and FBI interview summaries already released contain specific and documented allegations involving Trump that make the missing half of the document universe so specifically alarming. The law was signed. The documents were not released. The indices confirm they exist. The reporting identifies their relevance. The bipartisan accountability warnings are on the record. And the gap between the public commitment to transparency and the documented private reality of suppression is the most specific and most consequential evidence of the biggest cover-up characterization that the entire second term has produced. Drop a comment below and tell me what you think. Do the accountability mechanisms force the release of the missing documents, or does the cover-up hold despite the documented evidence and the bipartisan pressure? I want to hear from you.